Hello again, I'm Kevin, your instructor. Today we're going to be covering Chapter 3 for Introduction to Psychology, Biological Psychology, which also sets us up for next week when we begin to talk about sensation and perception. Okay, great. So for this chapter, we're going to be focusing on the two of the body's communication networks. We're going to be looking at the nervous system and we're going to be looking at the endocrine system. The nervous system communicates with neurotransmitters. The endocrine system communicates with hormones. To begin, we're going to talk about the nervous system. So the nervous system communicates using neurons that release neurotransmitters when stimulated. Okay? Neurons are simply cells, and they travel just like through telephone wires travel with phones. You can think of the body just consisting of a bunch of telephone wires, and the neurons travel within these telephone wires called axons, and they travel all the way from your brain all the way down to your feet, and then they can send information back up also. Okay? Great. So to begin with, we have to look at the anatomy of a neuron. Okay, so this is a classic example of a neuron right here. This round part in the middle is the cell body. These little tentacles on the end are called the dendrites. And then here you have your terminal buttons, which are connected to an axon, which is our telephone wire. So basically what happens is a stimulus will stimulate the dendrite of one neuron. Okay? This causes the cell to get a slightly less electrical charge. When it has a slightly less electrical charge, sodium atoms fill in and then it releases a signal to release neurotransmitters through the terminal buttons, which then communicate with the next neuron. Okay? So here's an example. So for again, when a dendrite is stimulated, it sends an electrical signal here, which tells the terminal buds to release neurotransmitters in the synapse, this space between neurons. And then over here, the next neurotransmitters, the dendrites of the next neuron, will absorb these neurotransmitters, and that will then stimulate these dendrites to then become slightly less electrical for the cell, which then causes an infusion of sodium, which then releases an electrical signal to release more neurotransmitters to talk to the next cell. So again, take my hands as an example, okay? I have a hair on my hand. If I stimulate the hair on my hand, okay, that stimulates the dendrites of the neurons that are sitting right here, okay? When I touch my hand or stimulate a hair, for example, the dendrites then send a signal to the cell body that causes it to be slightly less electric. Okay, that signal then travels through the axon to the terminal buds, which then releases neurotransmitters. And then the next neuron's dendrites will be stimulated by the neurotransmitters, which then causes the next neuron cell body to become slightly less electric and then electrically negative and then filled with sodium. And then it just goes all the way down the line like this, okay? So again, this is how neurons communicate. Dendrite is stimulated, cell becomes slightly less electrically negative, sodium fills in, sends a signal down the axon to release neurotransmitters to talk to the next neuron. Okay? All right, great. So here's a picture of what happens again. You have a stimulus, like I tickled a hair on my hand, that then makes the cell that you're seeing right here, the cell body, become a slightly less electric. Sodium ions fill in, the charge flows down the axon terminal, releases neurotransmitters through the synapse, that gap between the two neurons, okay? And then the dendrites of the next neuron pick up, are stimulated, and then the signal then travels throughout your body. And it's the same thing with all of your senses, which we're going to talk about next time. So for example, light hits my eye, it stimulates the neurons in my eye to send a signal to my brain, and this is how that happens, okay? When the light stimulates the dendrites of a neuron, it then releases a signal after it's filled with sodium and becomes slightly less electric down the axon to the next neuron to communicate everything. And I like to think about this as the flashbulb effect. For example, when someone takes a picture and you're blinded for a second, it's because all the neurons in your eyes get fired at one time, okay? So that means they all got stimulated, they became slightly less electrically charged, sodium atoms fill in, it sends a signal to the axon to release neurotransmitters to communicate to your brain what you are seeing, okay? And then, as you guys are all aware after a flash bomb, it has to reset. So you're slightly blinded for a second after you've been flashed, because once a neuron's been fired, it then has to go through a refractory period where it becomes reset. And once the neuron resets, becomes electrically balanced, polarized is what they refer to it, then it can be fired again, okay? So this is the idea of the action potential. All neurons have the potential to fire, which means to send a signal that releases neurotransmitters. But this doesn't happen unless they are stimulated, okay? So when you stimulate a neuron, then it excites and is what they call it, and then releases neurotransmitters, okay? But then they have to reset before they can do it all over again, okay? So basically when a neuron is stimulated, they say it is depolarized, okay? That's the process of becoming slightly less electrically negative, the sodium filling in, and then firing a signal. That's depolarization. So then the cell has to get back to balance by becoming polarized again, which is why it has to reset during that refractory period, okay? And again, the synapses, as we discussed, this is where the neurotransmitters communicate. This is that gap between two different neurons where the dendrites are releasing, or the terminal buds are releasing neurotransmitters, and the dendrites from the next one are picking them up. Neurotransmitters are simply chemical signals, okay? And then hormones, same thing, chemical signals. Best way to think about these things. That's all they are. All right? Your book has tons of different neurotransmitters and what they do. It talks about a function of each one. What does dopamine do? What does glutamate do? So guys, look through all this. Serotonin, norepinephrine. So good information on here. I'm not going to bore you too much with all of this. You guys will get deeper into this, especially when if you're studying medical things, you're going to be studying the brain. So that's what that does. And then it also goes and talks about the effects of drugs, for example. What does heroin do? What does cocaine do? And again, these are just these are just causing neurons to release neurotransmitters. So when you take a lot of drugs, all they're doing is just inhibiting or exciting neurotransmitters to release chemical messengers to talk to the next neuron. Okay, so very interesting stuff in your book about that. I would look through that a few times if possible. It goes through every drug and every neurotransmitter and how everything is affected by drugs. It's fascinating. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the actual brain and behavior and the structure of the brain. Okay, again, monism is this idea that your mind and the brain are not separate versus dualism that think that your mind and the brain are. For this, we're just going to kind of look at everything and see where we go. Okay, so again, this is the idea, this is the idea of so in your nervous system consists of two different systems. You have the central nervous system, which controls the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which controls everything else. Okay, so again, the nervous system is broken down into two systems: the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, basically everything else. Okay, that's the best way I like to think about the nervous system. And then, again, you can go a lot deeper into all of this. The book delves deep into the peripheral nervous system, start talking about what everything does, the sympathetic, the parasympathetic. It goes very deep. So make sure you do a good study on the biology of the brain, okay? The best way to think about the brain is the hindbrain, midbrain, and the forebrain, okay? So again, your oldest part of your brain, the hindbrain, is your brain stem, which controls most of the most important parts of your body: heartbeat and breathing, and that is right here in the back. So again, any trauma to the back of the brain can result in serious paralysis and all kinds of other conditions, okay? The midbrain is going to be your limbic system, controls a lot of emotions, things along those lines. And then your forebrain is this outer part, that gray mushy area, okay? And the forebrain is where the areas are that make you the most human, the association areas, these things responsible for language and math and all these more complicated higher level functioning items are in the outer part of your brain, okay? And then the cerebral cortex itself is broken into two hemispheres. You have the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Not sure if you guys are seeing this backwards, if it's a mirror image on the video. But you have your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere. The left hemisphere sends information to your right brain. So if information is coming in your left eye, it goes to your right side. Information coming from your right eye goes to the left eye. But the thing about the brain is the hemispheres are specialized, okay? So your left hemisphere is primarily responsible for higher level functions like language and your sense of identity, and your right side is this idea about more about your emotions and your connectedness to the other things, okay? So each side is kind of specialized, okay? So again, here's the brain on the outer layer, okay? The thing is, you have a left side of the brain and a right side of the brain. The left side and the right side are both comprised of 4 different lobes: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital, and the temporal lobe. But you have a frontal lobe on your left side and your right side, okay? So in total, you have 8 lobes. And then these association areas, these specialized higher level functionings are contained in each one of these lobes has association areas that really make you unique as a human, okay? That higher level reflection is all here on the outside of your brain, okay? So again, you have 4 lobes on both sides of your brain, okay? So again, each hemisphere controls the opposite side of the body. Again, left hemisphere for language, right hemisphere for spatial relationships and emotions, okay? And then going between the 2 hemispheres, you have this thing called the corpus callosum, which is a set of axons. And again, axons are like your telephone wires for your the nervous system, okay? You have a set of axons going through the middle between both hemispheres that allows communication to be going from the left side to the right. So for example, if your left side is primarily responsible for language, information that comes into the right side of the brain about language will then be sent over to your specialized side, the left side, for language to really interpret the information that's coming in, okay? And again, when you look at neurogenesis and the damaged brain, let's say you have a stroke on the left side of your brain. Well, your right side of the brain technically has most of the same areas as your left side of the brain, so the right side of the brain can compensate for that and start taking over specialized processes that only the left side was doing, for example, okay? However, if you damage the axons going between the 2 sides, then the communication between the 2 hemispheres gets interrupted. Okay, great. To measure brain activity, scientists and researchers use all kinds of devices. EEG machine, that's what you guys see when you have all those lines going across. You've got the MEG that records magnetic fields. You've got the PET scan that records radioactivity of glucose. Some really cool machines that can be used to study the brain. However, despite all of our knowledge of the brain, we don't totally know everything there is to know about the outer brain. We don't know what every place does. It's not like completely, I mean, we kind of have a general idea, but we don't specifically know, where the associations are and what they do, because you can't necessarily just poke and prod everything to find out, okay? So there's so much more information that we don't know, we need to know as we continue to get more and more sensitive instruments to study the actual physical brain and brain activity, okay? All right, great. The book gets into all the different areas and what they do and where they're at. Okay, so guys, make sure you study up on some of these words: the hypothalamus, the medulla, what is it they're responsible for. That's really good information. You don't totally need to memorize all of that for this class. We will need to know what's the oldest part of the brain stem, okay, which contains the medulla. The limbic system, what is that? More about emotions, which contains the hypothalamus, for example. And then, what are the lobes on each side of the cerebral cortex, for example. So some big stuff there, but make sure you do a good study of these words. Okay. Again, the nervous system, the peripheral is broken down into all different parts. Okay, so you got the autonomic, sympathetic, parasympathetic. You can get deep into that. You get that a little bit more in other classes, but we're just giving you a quick overview. Okay, so we've covered the nervous system. Now we need to cover the endocrine system. So again, the endocrine system is like your body's way of communicating, okay? Your body releases hormones, which then communicate with your brain. The nervous system is incredibly fast, okay? It's a neural communication network that is almost instantaneous, whereas the endocrine system is much slower. But the endocrine system is where you're getting information like, I'm hungry. So your body releases hormones to tell your brain that you're hungry, and then your brain then tells your body to go out and look for food, for example. Okay, so a lot of you is driven by your nervous system, but a lot of you is driven by your own body's needs, because your body is telling your brain, hey, I need this. So your endocrine system is responsible for sex and aggression and hunger, for example, okay, which then talks to the hypothalamus, which then, so it's a whole big process of your brain and your body communicating. Information is going to your brain, from your brain into the body, and from the body to the brain, okay? So it's a very complex process, but absolutely fascinating. For a long time, we had this great debate about plasticity and whether the brain is continuously developing, and the answer is yes. Of course, you have developmental periods where this is going on way more than other times in your life, but the brain can regenerate neurons. The brain can learn new information. The brain can learn, build new dendrites. So this process is a lifelong process, okay? So just because you're 25 and your prefrontal cortex is officially developed doesn't mean you're done developing. That is a lifelong process, okay? So again, social neuroscience is studying the structure of the brain and brain activity. And they have some great stuff in here like oxytocin when you start, really studying what's going on. And oxytocin is why you feel bonded to another person, for example, because your body's releasing this hormone after having a baby or after sexual activity that makes you feel bonded to somebody else. So again, that's an example of the endocrine system in action, then telling your brain to release chemicals. It's a biopsychosocial process that is just beautiful. Okay. And then the binding problem, the question of how separate brain areas combine to produce a unified perception of a single object. Again, this is the ultimate goal. How does the brain work? But how does the brain work as a system? And how do we approach the brain not as just as interrelated parts, but how do the interrelated parts communicate with each other? How do they interact? So in order to understand the brain, you have to understand how every single part is interacting with everybody else. Same thing with society. You can't understand society just by looking at the basic structures. You have to know how the structures interact with the people that created the structures, okay? Great. So the body goes pretty deep and it starts getting into DNA and how your actual DNA influences your biology. How DNA influences your behavior and your mental processes, for example. So again, how much of you is based upon your biology and how much of you is based upon your thoughts and cognitions and your brain activity, and how much of you is based upon how you were socialized by your parents and your friends. So again, it's where we start to apply that biopsychosocial process to really understand people. Okay, we can't understand it without understanding how our DNA and our genes are activated and then express themselves, which then influences our personality and the way we behave and act, for example. So the book gets really deep into chromosomes, that which makes up your DNA. It gets into your genes that influence how you behave, for example. It goes deep into the differences between males and females, for example. It gets really deep, okay? And then there's some really cool ideas such as epigenetics. And epigenetics is all about how your environment can influence how your genes express themselves. And for years, it was thought that this could only really be done through natural selection. However, what we're beginning to see is that the environment influences your genes. However, it doesn't actually change your DNA. So there's a lot to epigenetics and how your how your genes are affected by the environment, and then how your genes and the environment then influence your personality. And it's a beautiful, huge picture, okay? To understand anything, we have to know biology, psychology, sociology, history to get a real big picture of why people act the way they do, okay? Great. So again, it gets into heritability. It starts talking about twin studies in the book, and twin studies are great because again, you can really see the influence of genetics on personality, for example. And they've done studies of fraternal twins versus identical twins, and then for schizophrenia, for example, if schizophrenia is in the genes, both identical twins have a 50% chance of getting schizophrenia, whereas with fraternal twins, it's only about 17%. Therefore, your genes do definitely impact the way your brain works and the way you act and behave, as evidenced by the twin studies. And my students, it turns out, love studying the twin studies. So definitely something we could discuss in the future. Okay, but again, genes do influence your behavior. Okay, great. Okay, and then to conclude everything, it's just, again, what I've been saying is this a big proponent of evolutionary psychology. How do we look at natural selection and nature nurture and really put it all into a big picture to account why people do what they do and act the way they do, okay? And so evolutionary psychology has been looking at ideas like, is consciousness a natural selection adaptation? Is our prefrontal cortex and these higher level association areas and the four lobes of our brain, are these all just evolutionary adaptations? Okay, and then how does the environment influence the release, the expression of these evolutionary adaptations? And again, the biopsychosocial theory is just my favorite because it considers all different sides of this picture, and so I'm a huge fan. Again, thank you so much for this lecture and attending. It's an honor. If there's anything I can do for you, just email me. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.